I have been attacked by some for my decision not to join the offensive against Iran. But at every stage, I've stood by my principles.
A few moments later.
The nuclear-powered British submarine HMS Anson has arrived in the Arabian Sea, taking position near the Strait of Hormuz.
So following up on our last video and this speculation of where the conflict is headed, I think it's pretty interesting to look at what our NATO allies are currently doing in the Strait of Hormuz, because we just got the announcement this week that the French and British navies are now announcing concrete plans to send minesweepers and naval ships to the Strait of Hormuz. Apparently a British nuclear submarine is already there. Not sure exactly what it's doing, but I suppose it's monitoring the situation, right? As they so often say, it's sort of laughable on one hand, but hey, it is worth noting at the same time. First, they issued a vague statement saying they might do something. Now we have concrete plans going. Heck, it might be 2029 by the time NATO finally shows up to the Strait of Hormuz. We understand these people move at a snail's pace. And really, I would argue they're kind of just filibustering and stalling and hoping the whole situation resolves itself before they actually have to do anything. But we are still seeing some signs of action. And it's worth noting that this is a complete reversal from Starmer and Macron, who previously said that obviously they would not do anything to help the United States. Macron had stated he would only help with the Strait of Hormuz if there was a ceasefire announced in the war. There's not officially a ceasefire announced in the war. Now, there are some negotiations going on, and maybe that could be a reason why the French are now saying, okay, we'll do something. Maybe there's some confidence, greater confidence in the negotiations than there seems to be publicly. Who knows? But nonetheless, I do want to discuss these latest moves here today and what they could mean for, say, oil prices, our geopolitical relationships, because you've heard a lot of talk about how NATO has completely abandoned us. They've turned on us. They're siding with Iran. And I stated, no, that was never the case. That's never been true. It was always going to be true that countries like Britain and France, who have way less secure oil and energy resources than America does, at a certain point, we're going to have to get involved here, right? The call by Trump to actually come do something, come help out. Ultimately, these leaders were always going to cave to, not because of Trump, not because of the United States or something. Sure, they are liberal, they are Trump deranged, but ultimately because of their own self-interest. And we're seeing that happen extremely slowly, but it is happening. And there's some interesting things I think need to be pointed out about this. So we'll get into it. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We greatly appreciate the support, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all the latest news and coverage. And that said, take a listen here. As you can tell, the British Royal Navy will now take the lead in forming this alliance to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Here are those full details.
A plan led by the UK and France is reportedly being drawn up to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to ensure the safe passage of merchant ships. Joining us live is News Corp's Europe correspondent and Sky News contributor Sophie Ellsworth. So what more do we know about this potential plan, Sophie?
So, Pete, the Royal Navy here in the UK are looking to send ships over to the Strait of Hormuz and using drones to detect any mines that might be in that strait, but in a bid to try and get the Strait of Hormuz opened back up, Pete, because as we know, this is impacting the entire world with exorbitant petrol prices that we're seeing all around the globe. So the UK is looking to do this, and something that I think would be welcomed by many countries around the world, because intervention, it seems, is needed quite quickly.
Problems that Asia is seeing at the moment, we are certainly seeing at the moment with fuel shortages and the spike in fuel, well, that will be coming for Europe. So in the not too distant future, which would no doubt give someone like Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, you know, a bit of a push to perhaps focus more on the Strait of Hormuz like you've been talking about.
Well, absolutely, Pete. And here in the UK, petrol prices are exorbitant. They're around a pound, should I say, £1.46, 47 pence here. So they're on par with Australia, if not a touch under. They're extremely high. They're complaining about it endlessly here, and rightly so. And we know the cost of living in Britain is already very expensive. So this is hitting households at a time when Sir Keir Starmer wants to please voters, because they are having upcoming elections in Scotland and Wales and local council elections very soon.
That's true. That's coming around quickly. So
Well, hey, that's the exact same point we made about it, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much Donald Trump is hated by Keir Starmer, or whether or not even intervention in the Middle East is all that popular among the British people. Ultimately, if gas prices soar sky high for a political party in Labour and for a prime minister in Keir Starmer, who are already heavily unpopular, headed into an off-year election, we know where that's going to end. We know where the blame is going to be laid. And ultimately, yes, there is a political nature to this, which is why I argued from the beginning, Trump had the leverage because Keir Starmer basically cannot afford to not get involved, cannot afford to ultimately abandon NATO or do whatever else for very specific political reasons.
I tell you what, when we succeed on May the 7th, here in Sussex and across the country, Starmer will be gone by the end of May.
And by the way, over the weekend, we also covered the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Diego Garcia. This is a British-owned military base in the Indian Ocean that is almost 3,000 miles away. The attack ultimately failed, but what it did demonstrate is that contrary to whatever the regime was saying, their public lies about how they only have short-range ballistic missiles, clearly their capabilities go a lot further than that, which even then would suggest London is in full striking range of Iranian ballistic missiles. We spoke, by the way, about how that vindicated Donald Trump's argument and really did show to Europe. You can sit here and claim that Iran is not your problem all you want, but it's not just an issue of gas prices. It's also an issue of not only do they have the missile capacity to reach you directly, they basically already signaled they're willing, they see you as legitimate targets, right? They already tried to attack multiple European-owned military bases in the Middle East. Now they go for Diego Garcia. You have to ask at a certain point whether European capitals potentially could be next, according to the secretly owned ballistic missiles that it turns out Iran has. And of course, this is another question that Keir Starmer was forced to answer, and potentially why just days after that attack, you suddenly see Britain moving itself along and getting involved. So
we couldn't even stop a 150 kilometre per mile an hour drone from getting through to hitting a sovereign base in Cyprus. That means we were unprepared. And the very fact that you immediately wanted to defend a destroyer meant you had failed to anticipate the need to defend Cyprus with a destroyer. But this smacks of a lack of war-fighting mentality that reaches right across the government, which is what we address in this paper about war-fighting readiness, where we are not at. And the chiefs of staff are saying, we need to be ready for war. So when are we going to be prepared, and prepared for what?
We are finalising the investment plan. That sits with the Strategic Defence Review.
It smacks of an enormous complacency.
Well, this smacks of the fact that for years there was underinvestment by the last government and the stripping out and following out of our armed forces.
We've had 18 months
Copyright
to deal
Ben
with that.
Wallace, who was Defence
I'm
Secretary.
not making a party political point.
Well, honestly,
I agree with Ben
14
Wallace.
years of underinvestment,
I agree with
18
Ben
months of
Wallace.
Labour government.
But take drones, for example.
We're picking
The whole-
up the underinvestment of your government.
Oh, and by the way, who was telling you that you needed to invest more and become serious about defense? Was that Donald Trump to NATO and all of the European allies? That would be correct there. So I certainly hope this moment is a gigantic wake-up call for America's friends across the pond, right? They basically thought that, oh, well, America's on its own. We don't have to help them. And then Iran starts attacking British military assets as well. And Britain basically finds out they were woefully underprepared in the beginning. Yeah, maybe don't let it happen next time. Maybe rectify that by doing something this time. And, you know, as usual, Keir Starmer is at a snail's pace saying he's going to start moving stuff, and we're seeing some of those plans, but we got to pick up the pace here, right? Certainly, undeniably. So don't mistake this video as praise for the British military command, or really more the Prime Minister, you know, that, oh, they're doing a great job, guys. Look, they're finally coming to the rescue. They're really not, but you know, they're looking like they might do something. So I'd give them probably a C- at the current moment. Before it was an F-, now it's about a C-. So we'll talk in a second about some of the interesting ramifications of what this means, right? Why it could be that countries like Britain are finally like moving the plans ahead to get involved. And if that maybe suggests, considering these countries' laziness, that perhaps, you know, the Trump peace talks with Iran could be going a little bit better than we think. But first, before we get into that, I do want to quickly point out to you that the growing list of NATO countries that have, NATO-aligned countries, I should say, that have now joined on the statement to say we're willing to help defend the Strait of Hormuz has now exceeded over 30 nations. And so while we're still awaiting action, we're glad to see that the supposed shattering of the Western alliances and the rise of BRICS or something is not really materializing in the way that at least people were claiming.
Tell you is, you know, we've been in overdrive here diplomatically, pushing our allies both here in Brussels and across capitals in Europe and in the Middle East to convince everybody. Unfortunately, it took some convincing that this is more important to them than it is to the United States. I mean, you know, we get very little, if any, oil through the Strait of Hormuz. You know, we have allies that are finally stepping up. I think, you know, from the time this conflict broke out, they were certainly non-committal to what they could bring to the fight or bring to help us. But, you know, they have done things that I think goes sometimes unnoticed. We had several allies here in Europe and in NATO that were providing key and crucial basing, overflight, and access that whether it's Suda Bay, where I was in Greece on the Isle of Crete, or whether it was, you know, other countries, including Germany and France, that were providing you know, our ability to prosecute this fight. So, you know, there are key allies that are contributing, that are providing things. We just want more, and we need more, because even though President Trump has been very clear, Maria, that, you know, we don't need this, it's good to act as a group of nations because this is ultimately going to help everyone. And an Iran that does not have a nuclear weapon, that can no longer produce missiles at scale, that can no longer menace the region and this strait, I think is good for the world. And ultimately, the world needs to step up and participate.
But with all of that said, here is the rather interesting question I think we need to pose to countries like the UK. Why now? Or maybe why now is not accurate. How about why now in a couple of weeks are you finally getting off your butt and doing something? Well, we could believe perhaps that suddenly Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and all of these characters grew some cojones and just said, oh, we're going to go in. Yes, we're going to do something. NATO, let's go. But is that really necessarily all that plausible? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, maybe they just understand they have to do it because of their own oil prices and what it means for the entire world, or, you know, especially someone like the UK who obviously did Brexit and they're trying to kind of find their place in the world after leaving the European Union. Maybe they don't want to burn America too much, which I would say is a smart strategic thing because the UK, more than any of those other European countries, currently does need America. These are all possibilities. The other possibility, perhaps, though, that we need to consider, given the fact that these countries thus far have shown just a total cowardice, right? They don't want to get involved. They're like, no, it's not our war. It's not our problem. This was started by America. Don't worry, we had no involvement. Is that if they're now willing to finally send their navies to the Strait of Hormuz, they must have some belief that the war is basically over or close to over, right? Because again, given how timid Keir Starmer is and how much of a fence sitter he is, do you think he would take any serious risk to actually put his navy in the Strait of Hormuz? Or does he seem to have some type of strategic belief that, well, it's going to be relatively fine, right? I'm going to show up way too late when everything is done, all the fighting's over, and be like, okay, look, see, we contributed. It's a possibility. Now, that's a theory. Who knows? Because as I've pointed out, you know, we're still waiting to see where this whole 5-day negotiation period goes. There's very much the possibility that the U.S. is preparing for an operation on Carg Island and this whole thing is far from over. But again, if we're going to try to just watch exterior signals for maybe what's about to happen, I would argue that it's a possible theory, again, not really anything of fact or anything concrete, but it's a possible theory that the UK is only now getting involved because they understand the risk has gone to zero, which I would argue, if that is true, is very good news for the greater course of this conflict, right? This is going to wrap up soon. It's not going to be a forever war. As David Chapman here points out, this is signaling that the war is nearly over. The Iranian capabilities are near zero, right? Because after all, if the UK believed this was a serious threat, would they really be deploying anything? I don't know. When there was a serious threat, they weren't deploying anything, so that's something interesting to consider. Europeans made it clear they would not get involved until hostilities had concluded, which is, by the way, exactly what Emmanuel Macron likewise said. If you remember, he clearly stated France will not do anything to help with the Strait of Hormuz until there is a ceasefire or whatever. And so there's no public announcement of a ceasefire, but now they're willing to get involved. It's interesting, right?
We are not a party to the conflict, and therefore France. We are not a party to the conflict, and therefore France will never take part in operations to reopen or liberate the Strait of Hormuz in the current context.
So again, who really knows? Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comment section, but that's just sort of a theory there that we ought to consider. Now, at the same time, it is worth noting before we get to praising or complimentary of our European allies, the Americans are still, as of now, basically the sole actor doing the entirety of the heavy lifting in the Strait of Hormuz. And it was announced just this week by the Pentagon that the A-10 Warthog and even Apache helicopters over in Iraq, that sort of side of the front, right, are now being deployed to basically strafe small boats and basically the Iranian, what I call the terrorist threat, because that's basically what it is, right? Terrorism. I mean, they don't have an air force, they don't have a real navy, but what they've been doing is sending these small attack boats to basically bomb the oil tankers. And so here's, of course, what the U.S. is doing to respond to that. However, the fact that the A-10 is being deployed does seem to suggest something very positive to me, which we'll explain in a second. But first, take a listen.
Destroying Iran's ability to project power outside of its borders. The A-10 Warthog is now in the fight across the southern flank and is hunting and killing fast attack watercraft in the Straits of Hormuz. In addition, AH-64 Apaches have joined the fight on the southern flank, and they continue to work on the southern side, and that includes some of our allies who are using Apaches to handle one-way attack drones. In Iraq, AH-64s have been striking against Iranian-aligned militia groups to make sure that we suppress any threat in Iraq against U.S. forces or U.S. interests.
So obviously, it's good news that America is doing something about the small boat terrorist threat that Iran is trying to pose over these oil tankers. And even better for military history fanatics, that the legendary A-10 is once again back in service. You know, they've been trying to retire this plane for like 20 years now, and they can never manage to do it because it's just too good at its job and too effective. But that's besides the point. What's noteworthy about this, and we've actually made this point before about the A-10, but I'm going to use it as another example, right, is that to me, it does seem to demonstrate total American air superiority over Iranian airspace. I know Iran has tried to counter that claim in recent days and claim, oh, look, our missile hit this plane. It's an AI video, whatever. But if you wondered what was propaganda and what was not, I take the fact that the A-10 and even Apache helicopters are being used over Iranian airspace as full proof of that. Why do we say that? Well, the A-10 in particular, for example, is what we would consider a low-altitude attack aircraft that's primarily meant for strafing things on the ground, right? Has that famous gun that goes, it basically sounds something like that. And what we need to understand is the A-10, okay, it doesn't reach very high speed. It's slow flying. It's low to the ground, which would mean what? If you're fighting a serious, it's basically meant to fight terrorists, right, and insurgents. Because if you're fighting a serious air force or something, flying that low and that slow, you're obviously a very vulnerable target. But if you believe you have such superiority that, well, we're not really worried about them hitting anything and we feel fully comfortable to go on these strafing runs. And by the way, it hasn't just been the A-10. We've seen F-18s and other fighter jets do the same thing, right? Low altitude strafing runs over Iran. Then that does seem to suggest the Trump administration isn't bluffing or spreading propaganda when they say, from a conventional military perspective, Iran's capacity has been decimated. Because if you're that confident over the skies, Same thing, by the way, with helicopters. Obviously, helicopters are sitting ducks, basically easy targets for any serious military. Then that likewise, again, does seem to suggest total air superiority here. So now the only question is, can we achieve, I guess, the same naval and ground superiority? Obviously, Iran's conventional navy is largely wiped out, but we have this small boat threat, mines potentially that they are trying to lay in the water. Will the UK finally get off its you-know-what and do something? We'll find that out. But again, just some latest developments here from the Strait of Hormuz that we are going to hope are positive signs that this is going well, right? So that said, let me know your thoughts. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.